Hi there, my name is Mae Lloyd, and today I'm going to be presenting my senior thesis on transgender hate crimes and hate crime policies and the effect of policy on rates of transgender hate crimes at the state level. My research question for this project was what relationship is there, if any, between statewide political leaning and ideology and the way that state hate crime legislation is structured with the rates of hate crimes against transgender individuals in that state. Starting off with some background and information, there have been a few trends in hate crimes in recent years. One of them is an uptick in LGBT-motivated hate crimes. There's also been an ideology going around that hate crime legislation is unnecessary because if vandalism or assault is already illegal, why do we need to tag that motivation or that label of a hate crime on there? The importance of this is that it adds a level of protection for victims and victims' family and comes along with sentencing enhancements for the crime. So despite this ideology, there has been an increase in the passage of hate crime legislation in recent years. Looking at some frameworks and concepts I used to shape this project, one is social institutions such as law enforcement, government, and law. Another is social constructs such as gender, hatred, and crime. And primarily, I'm looking at the relationship between these social institutions and social constructs and exploring how they influence and build on one another. Looking at the literature review, there's a few sections I want to highlight. The first is political ideology. There's been a lack of support from conservative voters for hate crime legislation, and hate crimes can actually be a form of backlash against hate crime legislation and this perceived forced push for diversity. This ideology can often be used as justification for perpetrators' crimes. Another section I wanted to highlight was trans hate crimes themselves. They tend to be more violent in nature than other crimes and even other motivated hate crimes, with 2020 being the most fatal year for transgender individuals since 2013, according to the Human Rights Campaign. The targets of transgender motivated hate crimes are primarily male to female trans women and Black individuals. Looking at hate crime policies, it's found that gender identity is not always included as a protected category, and actually a lot of the times it's not. There's also differences in policies and how these policies are supposed to be enforced, how law enforcement is supposed to handle and track these cases, and that differs from state to state. More on law enforcement, there tends to be a lack of confidence from minority groups and victims of hate crimes in the police and in law enforcement, because they don't feel like their cases are being handled well or taken seriously. This leads to lower reporting rates when people feel that they can't trust law enforcement to take their case seriously. Other things that have an impact on reporting, policy that is comprehensive and includes gender or gender identity as a protected category increases the rates of reporting of gender identity motivated hate crimes. Additionally, having training for law enforcement on how to handle and track these cases is very important and can increase rates if people now feel like they can trust the police to take care of their case. There were some gaps in the literature that I noted, the primary one being a lack of focus on transgender victims and crime rates. The transgender population is highly understudied, and especially when it comes to hate crimes, there's just not a focus on them. Another gap that I noticed was there was a lack of research on the connection between policy and rates of hate crimes. Moving on to my data and methods and how I did this, the first thing I did was select which states I would be working with. I selected 13 states, 5 that were leaning Republican, 4 that were leaning Democrat, and 4 that were somewhere in the middle. With my Republican states, one of those states is Alabama, and I am considering it an outlier, which I will get back around to in a minute. So on this left column, you can see the states I selected, and then I used Cook's political report to determine their political ideology leaning. D stands for Democrat and R stands for Republican, and the higher the number next to it, the more skewed they lean that way. I then took those states and read all of the policy for hate crime legislation that exists in those states. I coded for 3 different things. The first thing I coded for was gender or gender identity as a protected category. 50% of the states included this. The next thing I looked for was a training requirement for law enforcement, and only 25% of the states included this. The last thing I looked for was a tracking requirement to track these cases, and 75% of the states included this. I then took those states and looked at the actual rates of hate crimes in those states, transgender or gender identity motivated hate crimes, and coded them per 2 million people to analyze my data. So here's what I found. Looking at political leaning and ideology, Democratic leaning states were more likely to include gender or gender identity as a protected category in their policy. There was no impact evident on a tracking requirement, as 75% of the states did include this, and they were pretty split across the board, Democrat and Republican leaning. One thing that I noted was only states with training requirements had some sort of Democratic leaning. Some were more Democratic leaning than others, some were more in the middle, but all of the states, including a training requirement for law enforcement, had some sort of Democratic leaning. Looking at hate crime policies and rates of hate crimes, there was a lack of clear evidence on the impact of policies on hate crimes. And I wanted to talk a little bit about why this might be, and this is where Alabama comes back into the mix. There's an issue with zero reporting. Alabama reported no gender identity motivated hate crimes from 2018 to 2020, and in 2018 and 2019 reported no hate crimes at all. If this doesn't sound right, it's because it's probably not. The issue of zero reporting comes up because these cases are difficult to track and are laid out to be tracked and handled in different ways, and sometimes they're just not reported. So let's talk a little bit more about why I found the results that I did. Possible explanations for why there was a lack of clear evidence of an impact. There's 3 that I wanted to discuss today. The first is crime rates. If crime rates are already higher for other types of crimes in a city or an area, are hate crime rates also going to be higher? Another explanation would be time. All of these policies have been passed in fairly recently and in recent years, and it might take more time than that for these policies to make an impact. The last explanation would be definition. What is and isn't a hate crime? Like I said, law enforcement isn't always trained to know how to handle these cases, and defining what is and isn't a hate crime and reporting it as such can vary from district to district, state to state. For future research, there's a few things I recommend. One would be increasing the sample size. I only had the opportunity to work with 13 states during the course of my research, but if we looked at more states, we might be able to see a clearer picture. We might also want to look at other marginalized groups. The transgender population, while very understudied, is also very small. Looking at minority groups that might be larger or have more legislation written around them or be more protected might show an impact of policy on hate crime rates. The last thing would be timing. Like I said, these policies are fairly recent, and so reconducting this study in a few years might yield better results. Overall, this research shows that political ideology does have an influence on the construction of policy, with Democratic-leaning states being more likely to include training and more likely to include gender or gender identity as a protected category. That being said, it does show a lack of clear relationship between policy and rates. This is important because it examines the transgender population, which is highly understudied and widely ignored, and it can help to shape future hate crime policy. Thank you.